The California Residential Purchase Agreement form is the cornerstone of every successful real estate transaction in the state of California. In this training video, we will review how to properly complete and use the RPA form step by step to better serve and protect yourself and your clients. This training is not intended to be a substitute for the advice of your broker, nor that of your attorney. We will cover paragraphs 15, 16, 17, and 18. Our instructor for this video is Kevin Burke. Let's get started.
Today we're going to be talking about final verification of condition. And so this is what we affectionately in our industry refer to as the final walkthrough. This is the part where the buyer comes into the property and takes a look around and makes sure that, two things basically. One of them is that any agreed upon repairs have been done in a workmanlike manner. And then the second thing is that the property is in the same or similar condition as it was when they first wrote their offer. Okay, so that's kind of important. I've had some interesting variations on that theme in my career, and hopefully you won't have that same experience. So let's take a look at our language here, and I'm going to set up my annotation because you all know I love to annotate things. And let's go ahead and we'll take a look at some of this. I'm going to move this up a little bit, and there we go. Okay, so final verification of condition. Once again, this is paragraph number 15, okay? So buyers shall have the right to make a final verification of the property. Now, I just explained it a little bit deeper than that, but we're going to see what the contract says about that as well. So this is usually towards the end. This is not something you're going to do in the beginning of the transaction or the middle of the transaction. This is going to be something you're going to do towards the end of the transaction. There is no requirement to do it. There is no law that says they have to verify the condition of the property. It's just that if they don't do it, and I would have them do a waiver of the final verification of condition if they choose not to do it, only because they're gonna come back with things like, well, I relied on my agent and stuff like that. So we actually have a form. It's the final verification of condition form. I'm going to pull it up in another window while you all are looking at that, just to see if I've included it in. No, I didn't. Okay, never mind. And of course, that's not going to work. Okay, so let me just get back to where we were. And some days a diamond, some days a stone. So I'm going to go back to my mouse and I'm going to take a look here. I'm going to cancel that. Okay, all right. So that being said, let's get back to the subject matter. So there is a form called the final verification of condition form. It's blank in the middle. There's nothing in there. And essentially it says similar language to what you have right here. The purpose behind the form is for the buyer to note things that are not consistent with the language that we're about to read. So let's take a look at that language. So buyers got a right to do a final walkthrough. It's a right. It's not a duty. They don't have to do it. It's a right to do it, and the seller doesn't want to interfere with that buyer's right to do that, okay? So the default language in the contract says sometime within the 5 days. And so when does this become a challenge? This becomes a challenge when we've forgotten that there's a tenant in the property and the buyer's taking the property vacant. So remember, your contract language back in paragraph number 4 said that the property will be delivered if it's tenant occupied and the buyer's not taken over the tenant, then it shall be delivered 5 days vacant, 5 days prior to close of escrow. So you got to make sure those numbers line up. So if you've scheduled your closing for the end of the month and the tenant's lease goes until the end of the month, then the seller's already going to have a problem because the property's not going to be vacant during that last 5 days. And that's what the contract says. All right. So this becomes a big deal. Okay. So again, 5 days inside of that window, you can expand it, you can contract it, you can make it 10 days, you can make it 3 days, you can do whatever you want to do with that. But the default is 5, and that's the one that everybody kind of understands. So again, remember that if you've got a tenant in it, you need to have addressed the issue of the tenant. If your tenant's lease expires on the 30th of June, for example, then you want to have your transaction close on the 5th of July, that kind of thing, okay? So because, you can't, the tenant has a right of use and possession and quiet enjoyment of the premises, so you want to be careful that you are not interfering with that, and you got to make sure you're doing the math as the listing agent. And I've had this go very bad for listing agents in the past where the agent didn't realize, oh my God, I didn't think about the tenant. We've got a contract that says we're going to get closing, we're going to get paid, and all that stuff's going to happen. but we forgot to account for what are the legal rights of the tenant in the property, okay? And so they get the seller involved in a transaction that seller says, no, wait a minute, I told you there was a tenant, and I don't understand all this contract stuff. So now we know that could be an issue for us, okay? So 5 days is the default language, and that is when? Prior to the close of escrow, okay? So prior to closing, not after closing, okay? Now, what happens from there? This is important. So it is not a contingency of the sale. So here's the thing. If it's not a contingency of the sale, then what's the purpose behind it? Well, the answer is that we don't really want to make it a contingency because then it becomes a renegotiation. But we want the buyer to give the seller notice of anything that they find that isn't right. And again, we get back to that VP form, that final verification of condition form. And on that form, the buyer would write in the stuff that they've got that isn't consistent with what their thought of the contract was, but solely to confirm. And then let's talk about those two things, okay? Solely to confirm, one, the property is maintained pursuant to paragraph number 11. So as I said before, that the property's in the same or similar condition as it was at the time of the offer. Okay, so if it was a 4-bedroom before and now it's a 3-bedroom, that's probably going to create some challenges. And we'll talk about what the recourse the buyer might have at that point. But again, I'm going to defer you to your attorney. I'm going to defer you to your broker. This is just going to be my practitioner's experience after 41 years of doing this. Okay, so number 2, that any repairs have been completed as agreed. So, and again, remember, in a workmanlike manner. And number 3, and the seller has complied with seller's other obligations under this agreement. And again, here we go. This is my CAR form VP. Okay, so here's the thing. Why is that a problem? Okay, well, here's why. So if the property has been maintained that in the condition that it was at the time of the offer, then everything is okay, right? If it's not maintained the way that it was at the time of the offer, then the buyer needs to note that on the final walkthrough. It's a formality to do it there. My non-legal advice would be to do it there so that you're at least notifying the seller of the fact that, hey, you know what, this is inconsistent with what we agreed to. And so now I want, here, I'm giving you an opportunity to address it. Seller doesn't have to address it, but the buyer is documenting it and putting it on the form so that they've made the seller aware prior to the transaction transferring from seller to buyer that the buyer has a problem with some of the items that are contract based. It gives the seller an opportunity to take care of things, but if the seller doesn't do it, then guess what? The buyer at this point still has to close, right? Because remember, it is not a contingency of the transaction, still has to close the transaction, right? Again, I'd be talking to counsel at this point, but not a contingency of the transaction, and therefore close and then sue. So most of our lawsuits of this nature that come about, for the first time at the closing or at the final walkthrough are usually going to be small claims court issues. They're not going to be deep issues into Superior Court normally, okay, but a lot of small claim stuff, and listen, not everybody likes to go to court. I suggest that you avoid it if you can, but if you have to be there, go. Okay, so number 1, property's been maintained in the condition as it was at the time of the offer. Number 2, repairs have been completed as agreed, and as it says in the contract, it says that the repairs will have been done in a workmanlike manner. And so addressing that issue, we personally, we're going to talk about that in paragraph number 16. Maybe I'll just go into that then. Okay. So I tell you, in our world, what we do in our brokerage, at least, is we try to get credits for repairs because you just never know what you're going to open up if you start doing work prior to closing, and sometimes sellers want to try to do the work themselves. So we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay, so repairs have been completed as agreed, and then number 3, that the seller has complied with the seller's other obligations under this agreement. Okay, everybody good with that part? Okay, all right. Seeing no questions, I will move forward to the next page. We're going to talk about our repairs. Okay, so remember, California, the statute in California says that the sales of real property are in their as-is condition, which means that the seller has no obligation to do any work at all. That's all that that means. And I see people try to rewrite that language in counteroffers, property being sold as is. What you really need to say is the seller's drawing a line in the sand at the time of the counteroffer that we're not going to do anything. We're not going to do any work. The seller still has an obligation by statute, by TDS 1102, right? Civil Code 1102, by statute to disclose any known material facts that the seller is aware of on the property. And again, if the seller's not aware of anything, then they still have to use the TDS unless they're otherwise exempt. And there are very few exemptions to that TDS. Okay, it's a statutory form. I recommend that you get it. I recommend that you do it. Okay, so let's talk about my repairs. My repairs, so in number 16, oops, back to my, okay, that's what happens when I jump ahead of myself here. So, and I got to jump ahead of myself again. Okay, let me move this over. Final verification of condition. Where'd my screen go? Linda, okay. Here we go. Okay, so final verification of condition, and I'm going to clear all my drawings. I'm going to go back to my mouse. Apparently, I have taken a picture of the document, so that's something that we don't need. Okay, and clear all drawings. No, it doesn't like that. I'm going to close that. And of course, that will take me back to this other thing, which is not where we want to be. And so I'm going to go back in and share my screen again, which means I've got to go all the way back down the path into this program. Okay, so give me 1 second and I'll pull this back up. Definitely don't like it when that happens. So we're going to do classes, we're going to do webinars, and we're going to do RPA, and we're doing paragraph. That's our LA. We're doing paragraph number 15 through 18. And so once again, I'm going to pull up paragraph number 15. Okay, so here's paragraph number 15. Oops, I'm sorry. I should probably share that with you. And there's my share screen. And it is still not happening. Okay. There it is, and let's see that you can actually see that. And we're going to share, and then here to make sure that you can see it. There we go. Okay, so you should be able to see this just fine. I'm going to go to paragraph number 16 finally, after wasting a little bit more of your time there. So we're on paragraph number 16. Let's talk about, get my annotation back, get my drawing back. Let's talk about number 16. So repairs shall be completed prior to final verification of condition. So the seller waiting until the last minute to do repairs is not going to work, because the buyer is going to be insisting that they have an opportunity, which they have the right by contract, to verify the condition after the seller has done the repairs. So a delay by the seller could create kind of problems for that. So if the seller is going to do the work, have them get started on it in a timely manner. But remember, those repairs shall be completed prior to final verification of condition, unless we have some other agreement in writing. Okay, so as I said, in our office, we prefer a credit, but you do it whatever way your broker tells you to do it, or whatever way your experience says is best. So repairs to be performed, okay, at the seller's expense may be performed by the seller or through others. And so here we are, we're saying, okay, guess what, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, it could very well be that the seller, if you leave the seller with the option, the seller could try to do it themselves. And I told you a story once before. We had a property we were buying, and the fence in the backyard was never at a, straight up and down. It was always at different angles all the way around. And the buyer said, or the seller said, I'll fix the fence. Because we said, fix the fence. And he said, I'll fix the fence. And then, of course, we looked in the garage where he had created a pull-down stairwell for an attic, and he had cut through the trusses. So when you cut through the trusses, you kind of you harm the structural integrity of the seal of the roof. And so we said, nah, we'd like to just get a credit for that. So the seller was disappointed. They had a lathe in the garage. I mean, they really had it dialed in. But the problem was, then they do stuff like that, and it's like, okay, so it's like woodwork 101. So we don't want to have that. Okay, so repairs to be performed at seller's expense may be performed by the seller or through others, provided that the work complies with applicable law. Okay, so we want to make sure that it applies with the law, the code, all those kinds of things, including permits if necessary, inspection and approval requirements, all of those things. So if the seller decides to do all those things, like my little brother is an electrician, and he could do his own electricity. And so, but I can tell you, like in all professions, there's all these workarounds, right? So we want to make sure that we have someone that we can go to later on in case the work is not done right. And so, and by the way, if the seller does the work themselves, there's nobody to go after except the seller, okay? And if the seller hires somebody to do it, then there's no privy of contract between the person that they hire and the buyer, which creates an additional problem. But let's look further. Let's see what else we got in here. So repairs shall be performed in a good, skillful manner. That's what I said earlier, workmanlike manner, with materials of quality and appearance, okay? So quality and appearance comparable to the existing materials. In other words, we kind of like it to match if we could. If it's being used to replace part of a wood member, we don't want it replaced with steel, that kind of thing. We want it to be something that makes sense. And again, we like the seller hiring a professional to do it if the seller is going to do the work and not do a credit. But again, the seller has now privy of contract between themselves and that service provider, and that's not something now that the buyer may have. So the question really is, does the buyer have recourse against the contractors that the seller hires, assuming the seller hired a contractor to do it? Sometimes they get a handyman out there, and as you know, the law in California says anything above $500, they have to have a license, and that rule gets broken all the time. I tell you, all the time. So they have sting operations all the time, and it's just it's kind of a favorite deal for some people. Okay, so we want to make sure that, again, that they are done with materials of quality and appearance similar to existing materials, okay? It is understood. So now we're telling the buyer that you understand, okay? The buyer understands that exact restoration of the appearance or cosmetic items following all repairs may not be possible. I mean, it's just, we can't make anything perfect. And as most of you know, if we have work done by a wood destroying pest contractor, their contract normally says we'll give you the property back in paint ready condition, which means we'll give it back to you, so that you can go ahead and paint it, but we stop at that point. Some arbitrary thing, they've decided that, they're not gonna try to match paints, whatever. Same rule applies in here. If the seller hires somebody to do it, then that means that we're not going to maybe necessarily get it back the way that it was, okay? Or something that's not going to be pleasing to the buyer. And those could be issues for your seller and for your buyer, okay? So again, I'm going to head you back to that credit. That might be the best solution, but you do whatever is appropriate and in your situation. Every situation is different, folks. Every situation is going to be different, okay? So let's take a look here. Seller shall, one, obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs performed by others. So if the seller does in fact hire a contractor to do something, which we hope that's what they're doing and not their brother Bob to do things, then we need to see invoices, we need to see receipts. Now we can't ask the seller for an invoice on self-help. If the seller does the work themselves, they can't really invoice for it, right? The IRS doesn't like that. Nobody seems to like that. You can't bill yourself, bill your own hours out for stuff, even if you might otherwise be qualified. But we can ask for receipts for materials or things like that. So obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs performed by others. Prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by the seller if the seller did the repairs. So now see how this is getting pretty complicated? So for the seller to do the work themselves, we'd like to see some kind of a written statement that says, here's what I did, here's the date that I did them, and then by the way, I've got to have those paid receipts, for materials and things like that. One of the issues that comes up later on is that the seller hires people to do work in the property, and then we have that form that nobody seems to use called a notice of non-responsibility. Where the contractor comes back, files mechanics liens on the property, because the seller didn't pay them, things like that. So those create other challenges for us, and we want to try to avoid those as best that we can. Okay. Everybody good with that? Okay, so prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by the seller and the date of such repairs. And then number 3, provide copies of invoices and paid receipts and statements to the buyer prior to final verification of condition. It seems kind of redundant from paragraph number 1, obtain invoices and paid receipts for work prepared by others, but down here we're talking about all things. So invoices, all paid receipts, and statements to the buyer prior to the final verification of condition. So now back to my final verification of condition. Remember that it said that the buyer has the right, not the duty, to do a final walkthrough, final verification of condition 5 days prior to closing. If there's a tenant in it, that means it has to be vacant. So 5 days prior to closing. So make sure you have that in your calendar, in your brain, that if you write an offer on a property that's got a tenant in it, make sure you take into account when the tenant is supposed to be vacating the property. And of course, if the tenant doesn't vacate the property on time, then all kinds of other stuff's going to happen. And all of a sudden, everybody's a lawyer. Okay. So, all right. So that being said, so for my repairs, they have to be done in a workmanlike manner if the seller tries to do them themselves. If the seller hires a contractor to do them, then we might, we get the invoices, we get the receipts, but we might not be able to go after that contractor. We might have to go after the seller, who then goes after the contractor if the work isn't done right. And I see this on bigger projects, bigger things that are done, and then it can get pretty unfortunate. And then at the closing, the buyer says, "I'm not going to close," and that may be, we don't want to get involved in that, because that might be breach of contract, right? So it's not our issue. It's going to be between the buyer and the seller, and so we want to try to, at least to the best of our ability, we want to try to make things as easy as possible for everybody, so that they don't, get themselves all into a state about stuff. Okay. All right. Now, again, if you have any questions about any of this, and I apologize, this is taped, but if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free. Send me an email. You got my email address on there. My telephone number was on there on the first slide as well. If you want to call me, more than happy to do so. But it's a dicey little subject, and there's some very good Q&As in the program, in the car.org program, about some of these issues. Okay. So I know that today is Wednesday for me, Thursday for you, but I'm going to be doing the RP or RLA on Wednesday. So you missed it. Hopefully we're at it, but I'm going to actually pull up the revised version of the RLA. We're all very fortunate here with the RPA that we decided to bag the revisions that we were going to do, that were supposed to take effect in December of 2020, because of all the panic, pandemic, whatever was going on. And so instead we were focusing our energies on the other forms that we had to create. We had to create a whole bunch of forms to respond to the issues that were at hand. So the good news is you don't have to worry about an update to the RPA until December of 2021. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about at that time. In the meantime, we are moving forward in our educational system here. We are moving forward discussing contract terms as they are in the new RLA. So the RLA has changed. Most of it is we're at the end of it on Wednesday. So it's mostly going to be the just changes to paragraph numbers, but the topic material we're going to be talking about anyway. So, okay, that being said, that's my issue of my repairs. So we've already covered my final verification of condition. Now we've covered our repairs. Now let's take a look at our prorations. So we want to look at prorations. Now remember what I said before? So these paragraphs that we're talking, 15 through 18, we're talking about paragraphs that there's really nothing for you to do. The bad news for that is that means we never read it. And I'm preaching to the choir. You're all here. You're going to know this better than probably 99% of the industry is going to know it, unless they've been involved in litigation, and then they probably really know it. But as I said to a caller last night, I said, listen, I'd rather teach it now than have to, get hired by your attorney to help with your defense, at a later time. Let's learn this stuff now. So, and again, you all, thank you for being here. This is important stuff, and I want to make sure that you're covered. So again, call me, email is best. Telephone doesn't work for me. I'm always doing something. So, okay, so let's take a look at now paragraph number 17. We're going to talk about prorations of property taxes and other items. So you always have that buyer that says to you, well, I want to make sure a couple of things. One, I want to make sure that that there aren't any bills left over that the seller hasn't paid that I'm going to be held to have to pay for. Okay, so that's going to be, how do we get rid of those bills? How do we make the buyer feel okay about things? And that's going to get back to my title, right? So when I get my preliminary title report, it's going to tell me, here are the things that we see that are going to be issues. Here are the things that attach to the property. Here are the things that are going to remain. Here are the things that are going to leave. And again, we did a whole class on how to read a prelim last week, and I thought it went really, really well. So that being said, I don't want to pay the bills of the seller after closing. That's number one. Number two, how do I know that everything is going to be prorated until the date of close of escrow? Well, so here's the thing. We have it in the contract. We have in the contract how we're going to handle that. Okay, so property tax is just one issue. So we want to make sure that if the seller has already paid the taxes, that the buyer reimburse the seller for the amount of taxes that the seller overpaid. If the seller hasn't paid the taxes, then we want the seller to bring it current by paying the amount. And those figures are going to be different numbers for both the seller and the buyer, because as you know, the property tax that the seller is paying is going to be different than the property tax that the buyer is paying. So the seller is paying, just like the buyer, the seller and buyer are both going to be paying taxes based on the purchase price of the property that they bought it at the time that they bought it. So when the seller bought the property, let's say the seller bought it for $500,000, the seller is paying a property tax based on $500,000. Okay, and then the buyer is buying the property for $600,000. The buyer's tax is going to be different. Okay, so, but the only number we have in front of us is the number that the seller is paying, and that's going to be up to escrow, that's going to be up to title to verify those amounts, okay? And then they're also going to verify special assessments and other liens against the property. That's their job, and that's what this paragraph addresses, okay? So let's talk about that. So again, it's not just property taxes, it is also other items. Okay, so unless otherwise specified in writing, otherwise agreed in writing, unless you've got some kind of a writing someplace that says differently, the following items shall be paid current and prorated. So this is the contract language, okay, between the buyer and seller as of what? Date of close of escrow. I like to call it date of recordation, but close of escrow is kind of the vernacular, so we tried to make the contract sound, so that in a language that people would understand it, okay, right? It has to be written in plain English. So in the legal field, we think of recordation, we think of transfer between seller and buyer, we have different names for things, different terminology for things, but in the real estate profession, all we think about is the date of closing, which means the date I get paid, that kind of thing. So, all right, fine. So we're going to use that. We're just going to say that everything is going to have to be prorated and paid current as of date of close of escrow. And that's going to be what? It's going to be my real property taxes, so not personal, my real property taxes and any assessments, okay, any interest, any rents. So there's a tenant in the property. Well, by the way, let me back up. So assessments, Mellorews, things like that are assessments against the property. And that's why when we talked about the prelim and we got that tax statement, it showed all the things that are an issue that, has to be, addressed by the escrow and the title company. So interest. So any interest that's being paid on a lien or anything like that, any rents, there's a tenant in the property, and let's assume that the tenant is going to remain in the property, and the buyer's aware of that, of course. The rents will be prorated. So if the buyer buys the property on the 15th, and the tenant made their rent payment on the 1st for the entire month, then the buyer would have to, that rent payment would have gone to the seller, the owner of the property. So the buyer would have to then receive a reimbursement for the remaining part of the month, that 15 days in which the buyer now owns the property and the seller already got the rent. So if the rent was $1,000 for the month, then that means that on the 15th of the month, if closing's on the 15th, then the seller would have to cough up the $500 for the balance of the month to the buyer. And we're kind of counting on escrow and title to know about that, and because obviously we've got to tell them there's a tenant in it. Now we've had it happen where they say, "Well, we didn't know there was a tenant. There's nothing in there anywhere that said there was a tenant in it." That's why we have to be thorough with our paperwork at the very beginning of the transaction, okay? Everybody good with that? So rents are prorated. HOA, so let's talk about HOA, and there's a number of those: regular assessments, special assessments, and any emergency dues and assessments imposed prior to close of escrow. So in other words, we're going to make sure that all the HOA dues are current, and that's a very common question from your buyer. Your buyer says, well, how do I know they're going to pay the HOA dues? It's like, well, it says it right in the contract, and this is an instruction to escrow, remember, and joint escrow instructions. So this is an instruction to escrow on what to do. So if they make a mistake, then it goes on them, okay? So and special assessments, I want to key that in because if they are currently, if there's a special assessment against the property, then obviously the buyer is going to want to have those special assessments paid unless the HOA has set up payments on it, in which case the buyer needs to be asking the question, is this a payment situation, or is the buyer going to want the seller to pay that HOA off, okay, the HOA assessment off. Okay, premiums on insurance assumed by the buyer. So the buyer is going to assume a seller's insurance policy, okay, could be a home warranty, it could be a lot of things, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to prorate those premiums as well. How about payments on bonds? Bonds are usually done for improvement projects and things like that. So bonds and assessments that the buyer is going to assume. And again, you have to tell the buyer what they're going to be assuming. So that's kind of it's the rule, right? So again, a lot of that stuff shows up in my preliminary title report. Okay, so any payments on bonds or assessments sued by the buyer, and payments on Mello-Roos. Okay, so this is always the hot button, and this is the one. I had a seller, back in when was it? It might have been 2000. We're selling their property in Carmel Valley, and it was in Carmel Village. And the seller said, I'm not paying Mello-Roos. And so I said, well, I don't know. I think it was from October of '88. They started putting Mello-Roos assessments on things, especially in Carmel Valley. And so we pulled up a copy of the seller's tax statement, and there it was. It didn't say Mello-Roos, it said Community Facilities Coalition District, something like that. And the seller goes, wow, I didn't know that was Mello-Roos. Well, it's a big ticket item. So we want to make sure that the buyer is aware. Again, statute requires that the seller make the buyer aware that there is one. Okay, that there is a Mello-Roos assessment, and then two, that that payment is being prorated. And so the seller needs to make sure that the buyer is aware of those things. I have a situation right now where haven't been brought into it yet, but apparently a seller sold a property to a buyer, and it was only a couple $100,000, which is probably everything that the buyer had in their name. There was no title, there was no escrow, there was no nothing. Buyer literally handed over $200,000 in cash to the seller, and that's just horrible. They have no title, they have nothing, but they've given up $200,000 of the money. God only knows where the seller went. So that's why we want to hire professional services to take care of these things when we're in the middle of a transaction. And that situation is just going to be, really not good. And they're going to be elderly issues, and okay, good. No agents, everybody decided they were going to save some money. And so they saved money. All right. They saved a lot of money. So, okay. So Mello-Roos, and then any other special assessment district bonds and assessments. So if you ever take a look, I don't know of a property that doesn't have a special assessment on it. So the way you find out, you pull up a copy of that tax statement, and you'll see your friendly neighborhood title company should provide it for you. And I did this in my prelim class, but there should be a statement. It's going to show you, mosquito, vector control, all these other assessments that are against the property. And you might think, well, it's no big deal. I mean, they all add up to like $200. Okay, $200 semi-annually. So, do you want that bill? Would you like to get that bill? And that's why you want to make sure that, that the buyer is aware of those things, and that escrow is going to take care of those things. Okay. So those are items that are now a lien. If they're not a lien, then it's something that, if the seller's aware of a lien that's coming, then the seller needs to be making that disclosure. Okay. All right. That being said, the following items shall be assumed by the buyer without credit toward the purchase price. So again, prorated payments on Mello-Roos, it's a big deal, okay, and other special assessment districts and bonds assessments and HOA special assessments that are now a lien, okay, but not yet payable. Okay, all right, so they're a lien, but they're not yet payable. So guess what? The buyer is going to assume those payments. Okay, all right. Property will be, and this is a statement to the buyer so that the buyer is aware that, again, they're not going to be paying the same amount of money in taxes that the seller's paying. Seller's paying based on what they paid for the property at the time of the purchase, depending on what year they bought it, obviously, prior to Prop 13, that kind of thing. Okay, so, but the property will be reassessed upon change of ownership. Okay, so when the buyer assumes ownership of the property, then there will be an assessment. We call that the special tax assessment. and that is a bill that they will get approximately 30 days after the transfer of title from the seller to the buyer. Let's talk about that. We're going to hit a little bit of that. So any supplemental tax bill, which is what we're talking about, shall be paid as follows. All right. So for periods after close of escrow. Now, why do they say that? Because you know what? You're doing a transaction, the seller's a flipper, or the seller bought it only recently and they did not pay their supplemental tax bill. You know, we want to make sure that the seller takes care of that. The seller pays that supplemental tax bill. Again, that's going to be your escrow, your title company. That's why you like to use your own services, because you know what kind of quality you're getting. Okay. But for periods after closing are going to be picked up by the buyer. Periods before closing, we want the seller to do that. Okay. All right. And 2, for periods prior to close of escrow by the seller, okay? And so I like this form that we created. It's also included in your SBSA, but we have a form called a special property tax form that we actually use. The same language is included in the SBSA. I'm hoping you're using that form. It's the standard of practice in California. If you use the SBSA, you don't need also the SPT. The SPT would be for a situation where you're just notifying the buyer of that one particular tax. Okay, all right, and it explains it very nicely. I like the form. I think you should use the form. I think the forms will set you free. I really do. I think that you know, as part of your professionalism, is knowing what forms to use. And so I have people say to me, they say, well, there's 215 forms in the library. And my response is, yeah, but you're not going to use all 215 of them in a transaction. You just got to know when to use them. You got to know what they are. And that's why we're doing what we're doing, at least in the RPA and the RLA and the BRE. We're drilling into these forms because they reference the forms that are normally used in a transaction. So again, my SBSA is just the standard. We're going to do that in every real estate transaction that we do. We're going to use the statewide buyer and seller advisory form. That's what the SBSA stands for. And that form has morphed over the years from something much simpler than it is today. Today it's 13 pages long. It covers all kinds of stuff. Okay. And so as the legislative intent changes, as they come up with new laws, new rules, then we update that form on the state level. Okay. Everybody good with that? All right. So that's my SBSA. So that addresses the issue of my supplemental tax bill, my supplemental property tax right there, my supplemental tax bill. And again, either form helps. I prefer the SBSA. It's much more encompassing. It handles more stuff than just the supplemental tax bill. Okay. All right. Now, in caps, not a bold print, because it's not a, you know, it's not a contract you know, issue, but tax bills issued after close of escrow shall be handled directly between the buyer and the seller. In other words, escrow is saying, we're out of here. You know, once you guys have done this deal, once you close this transaction, then that means that we're done. Escrow needs to be able to walk away from it at a certain point. They've done their job. Anything that happens after that really needs to be on the buyer, between the buyer and the seller. So if the buyer, so again, I mentioned this earlier, the buyer is going to get a supplemental property tax bill, right? And so 30 days later, they're going to get this tax bill. And by the way, the buyer is going to call you on the phone and they're going to say, what's this bill? I thought the contract said that the seller would pay all of the taxes. And the answer is no, the buyer pays the lender policy, but then there's also the supplemental tax bill. So it's not a different tax. It's not a new tax. It's just a modification of the tax that was existing at the time that the seller owned the property. So again, buyer pays a different amount than the seller pays supposedly. And that's why we have that clause in there, and that's why we tell them about that. So you know what? I'm sorry, you're going to get the call. They're going to call you on the phone, and they're going to say, "Hey, what's this tax bill? Yeah, I thought the seller paid all the taxes." And your answer is, "Well, let's take a look at paragraph number 17, whichever one it is in the SBSA, and it discusses those issues." And that's why I think you should really know those forms and you should be prepared to address them. But you know, the worst thing that can happen to you, well, not the worst, but they call you on the phone, they ask you a question you don't know the answer to. I think you're all better prepared to answer their questions here today on these issues than otherwise. So again, I'd like to encourage you to continue to go to our sessions and look at these things, because we're giving you the answer to the question, okay? All right, then finally, prorations. Proration shall be made based on a 30-day month. So what do we call that? We call that a banker's month. So a banker's month is 30 days. So all our prorations, if it's February, there's 28 days in February. They're just going to take the total bill. The bill's $300. They're going to take that. Was fast, wasn't it? So they're going to take the $300 and they're going to divide it by 30, and that's going to be $10 per day. Okay, they don't care about 28. They're not going to mess with the 2 days because it's based on a 30-day month, which again is called a banker's month. So if it's 31 days in the month, and I'm not aware of any months that are more than 31 days, but if it's 31 days in the month, it's still computed based on 30. Okay, so all of our prorations are going to be based on a banker's month or a 30-day month. Okay. And you're going to have that client who's going to sit down and going to do the math on it and going to say, well, wait a minute, I'm doing this deal. It's not even leap year and I'm paying for 2 extra days of stuff. Well, no, you're not really, but you're paying 1/28 or 1/30th, higher than you think you're paying. But again, refer to the contract, paragraph number 17. We're going to prorate everything based on a 30-day month. And so this is a huge sentence, right? Because it addresses everything else up here. Okay, so it's like you got to know it. Okay, everybody good? Okay, all right, let's move on now to the next paragraph, and we're going to go ahead and click on that. And one of my favorite paragraphs, folks, it's compensation. I'm going to be brave here for a second and see if I can pull up, do I have any ancillary documents? No, I didn't have any ancillary documents in this. Okay, so let's take a look at our compensation. This is let me make sure you can see this because I switched screens on myself there while I was doing what I was doing. There you are. Okay, good. All right, so back to my draw feature, and let's take a look at my broker's box. So, we looked at paragraph. We look at the paragraphs and we go, wow, how are we gonna spend all that an hour and 15 minutes on one paragraph? Well, if you've looked at paragraph number 14, then you know that that's going to be something I could have gone days on that, right? When we're coming up on liquidated damages and arbitration, separate paragraphs, and we're going to spend an hour and 15 minutes on it. In my law class, when I'm teaching continuing ed for attorneys at the university, I spend 3.5 hours on liquidated damages. So, it's a favorite subject of mine. It's got teeth in it. And there's a lot of things that you really need to know about it. At the same time, we don't want you giving legal advice to your client. So your client needs to read it. And remember what I said before, whenever your client asks you a question that says, well, what does this paragraph say? Again, show it to them, upside down, right? Because you can read better upside down than you can right side up because you've been trained to do that. Okay, so, and you say, I don't know, let's read it together. And that's what I always say. That's always my defense. I'm always going to say that. And people say, oh, you gave me legal advice. I would say, no, you know what? I did not. I can bring in 50 different buyers, last 50 buyers. And every time they ask me a question, I always answered it. Well, I don't know what it says. Let's read it together. So you should learn that kind of language because, the contract has to be written in plain English. Okay. There has to be a meeting of the minds. And if there's no meeting of the minds, if it's not something that the principals understood that they were signing, then you might not have a contract. Again, talk to your lawyer, talk to your broker. That's when it gets fun. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's take a look at my paragraph number 18, and I'm going to have 2 subparts to 18, and this is going to be our wrap for the day. This is definitely going to take us another bit here. So we're going to talk about 2 different things. The first thing we're going to talk about is compensation, okay? That's the fun part of things. We like to be compensated, okay? Most of us think, and I have people all the time ask me to reduce my fee. Actually, I never do. I don't know why I said that. I just hear about it. Nobody ever asks me to reduce my fee. Maybe because they think I know what I'm talking about, or I might get ugly if they ask me to do it. But at the end of the day, it's whatever your contract says. So if you have a buyer representation agreement with your buyer, then your contract, your money's already specified. Okay, so regardless of what the seller is going to be paying for you. So again, this is the RPA. So I want you to remember, this is the contract between the buyer and the seller, and you do not want to be a part to that contract. So we just put together a transaction and we needed confirmation of acceptance by the buyer, and the buyer's agent initialed the box of confirmation for acceptance. I want to, myself in our office, we do everything we can to avoid, our name on a contract other than the fact that we're the broker in the transaction, because if there's going to be a dispute between the parties, we want them to have it, and we don't want to be, involved in that. So we don't want to be a party to the transaction. And people say, hey, you know what, Kevin, you understand the nuances. And I just had a really great compliment from a big broker who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And she said, you know what, you understand the nuances of the contract better than anyone does. I think it's the nuisances of the contract, but at the same time, yeah, I kind of get it. So I need to understand what compensation looks like. Okay. So people say, hey, you know what, remember my question about reducing fees. And so I like to tell people, listen, I give a lot of money to charity. And I give a lot of money to charity, but I like to pick my own charity, okay? And you are not that charity, all right? And we have a broker in our office who gives 10% of his commissions to charity, and God love him, he's a super guy, super broker, and he gives 10% of his money to the charities all the time. I personally want to be able to pick my own charity. So when somebody asks me about my fee, I mean, nobody ever does. I don't know why. Maybe I'm doing something right. Maybe we should have a class on that, okay? So let's talk about my compensation. And when we get into this, we're going to be talking about the quid pro quo. I expect to be compensated for doing certain work, and that's when we get into the scope of duty, okay? So remember what I've said to you before, that if you define your duty, you limit your liability, and that's an important concept to remember. Defining your duty limits your liability. In the past, we didn't have that. We didn't define our duty. We didn't define what it was. We didn't create our own job description. Let's think about that. We just kind of left it open, and the buyer would come in, they sue for this, they sue for that, they come all kinds of crazy stuff. And so if we had just written down what it was that we were going to do and create the expectation up front, rather than leaving it just open to the crazy mind, the reasonable man standard, that kind of thing, then we would have been better off. So let's look at my compensation. Seller or buyer, or both, whoever, as applicable, agree to pay compensation to the broker as specified in a separate written agreement between the broker and that seller or buyer. So the one for the seller is my what? My RLA. The one for my buyer is my BRE, right? So the RLA is the residential listing agreement. The BRE is the buyer representation agreement. Those are my two employment agreements that we use in the state of California for doing transactional work. The law requires that we have an employment agreement with our client. And so we've all been trained that the listing agreement is for sure has to be done. You can't advertise a property without one. You don't have an employment agreement. You have to have something that defines, what you're going to be doing for compensation, things like that. So now we're talking about compensation, okay? So between the seller, and then this is between the buyer, okay? Compensation is payable. So by the way, those are my two agreements, right? So my RLA is my agreement between the listing, the seller's agent, let's call it by the new terms. So the seller's agent and the seller. The buyer representation agreement is the contract between the buyer's agent and the buyer, okay? Stay tuned next week. Well, next week we're going to do a new forms, but the following week we're going to get launched into the BRE, and it's one of my favorite things, the buyer representation agreement, and I'm going to show you how to get paid in every single transaction that you do, okay? Whatever you think you're worth, okay? All right. So that being said, let's talk about compensation is payable upon what? Recordation, transfer of title from seller to buyer. Once I've done my job, your contract calls it close of escrow, but once I've done my job, I expect to be compensated. So I expect to be compensated at that time. So some people say, well, my broker doesn't pay me for 2 weeks. And my response is, it's not the issue. The issue is that the buyer or the seller agree to compensate the respective brokers at close of escrow. So that happens at that time. And we have to actually put that in there. Otherwise, we might have situations where, 2 weeks later, we're looking for our money. But the agent who thinks that they are entitled to get compensated at close of escrow is mistaken. It's the broker. This is the broker. This is the brokers in the transaction. And then you are compensated based on whatever your contract is with your broker. Okay, that's all. It's that simple. Okay, so or if escrow does not close as otherwise specified in the agreement between the broker Okay, and that buyer, seller, or buyer, I love that, right? What does that mean? That says, okay, if remember what the contracts of the RLA says. The RLA says if the escrow doesn't close and it's something to do with the seller, then the seller owes the compensation. Or if it closes by no fault, it doesn't close by no fault of the seller, something that the buyer did that prevented it from closing, that the broker's entitled to a piece of the award that the seller gets, no obligation, obviously. But if the seller goes after the buyer, then the broker, the seller's broker, is entitled to a piece of that action. Same thing holds true with the buyer representation agreement. If the transaction doesn't close, by whose fault was it? If it was the seller's fault, again, I'm on my BRE. If it's the seller's fault, then and the buyer recovers from the seller, then that agreement says that the buyer buyer's agent shall get a piece of the action from what the buyer recovers. If it's the buyer's fault, then the buyer owes the agent a piece of the compensation that they would have otherwise received. That's why we have this language that says if it doesn't close, then we're going to handle it based on those other written agreements. Now, of course, if you don't have a written agreement, then no duty to pay the commission. I would recommend against filing a complaint with the Department of Real Estate if you think you're entitled to get compensated for something when you don't have an employment agreement for that. Okay, kind of a big deal. But this is the part we miss a lot of times, where we're the buyer's agent and we don't have a contract with our buyer. Then we're essentially now at the whim of an additional person, whether the listing agent recovers against the contract with the seller versus us being able to recover directly from our buyer for breach or something along that end. Okay, and we're also relying on them to file actions and decide to go after their money. And I like to keep that in house. I like to be able to make that decision without having to wait for somebody else to take action. Everybody good with that? It's a really important concept. Again, remember charity. Okay, I'm into charity. I'm big on that. But at the same time, I expect to get paid so that I can give to charity. Okay, so compensation is a big deal for me. I like to get paid, and I like to essentially determine the result of how that's going to happen. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about scope of duty. And I've often said that we ought to have a whole class on compensation, and everybody has a heart attack because we can't talk about commissions. That's not what the law says. So you can talk about commissions, but it's whatever is personally, it's personal to you and your broker. We see it in transactions all the time where agents are sending us paperwork that's personal between themselves and the broker. Can you imagine I'm a listing agent, somebody sending me a copy of their buyer representation agreement, or a buyer's agent, and I send them a copy of my listing agreement? Those are the kind of weird things that we see in transactions that create other challenges for us. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's talk about my scope of duty. And remember what I said a minute ago, when you define your duty, you limit your liability. And this is something I came up with about 20 years ago. I've been teaching this for ages. Okay. I want everybody to understand, here's what I'm going to do for you. And so again, when I'm representing the seller, then we're going to talk about it in two parts. Talk about the seller, the duty to the listing agent to the seller's agent to the seller. And we're going to talk about the buyer's agent's duty to the buyer. Okay. And I'm going to have both of those by contract. Okay. All right. So let's do that. Buyer and seller. So parties acknowledge and agree that the broker, whoever it is, okay, the broker, is it the seller's broker, is it the buyer's broker? One, does not decide what price the buyer should pay or the seller should accept. And so we have this conversation all the time, right? And we did the CMA class yesterday. I thought that was a great class. And I can tell you, we said in that class that, when the seller wants to price their property, the seller can go ahead and pick the price. They need to pick a price that's marketable, but at the same time, it's not the seller that determines the price of the ultimate transaction. It's going to be the buyer, after negotiating with the seller. And so try not to get caught into the times, right? So like right now, there are people that say it's a seller's market. I just saw an agent on the news the other day telling everybody that the market's in the tank in San Diego. It's a total buyer's market, and again, it sells papers, right? But at the end of the day, work within your market, learn how to work in all markets, and don't be consumed by what's happening in the market. Consume yourself with what you're doing and make sure you're doing things the right way. So The broker doesn't tell the seller how much the buyer should pay. The broker doesn't tell the seller how much they should take. We always want to say, hey, we give suggestions, we do this kind of thing, but nobody's, somebody said nobody's holding a gun to your head. I think that's kind of a little out there, but at the end of the day, no, we're not going to tell anybody what to do. You've seen this before. You've seen this in your agency disclosure form, right? On page 1 of the AD form. You've seen it in your listing agreement. You've seen it in your buyer representation agreement. Okay. Let's look at paragraph number 2. Does not guarantee the condition of the property. I love it. Okay, so what does that mean? Does not guarantee the condition of the property. So, how many times do you end up where the buyer calls you after closing and tells you, hey, this isn't working. And it's like all of a sudden you're the warrantor of the product. Well, you aren't. We don't guarantee the property. That's not our issue. The issue is between the buyer and the seller. And so we had a contract back before October of 2002 where we had either seller warranty, which said that the seller warranted that everything was working just fine. And then we had what we really needed to have, which is that as is condition, which says that the seller doesn't have an obligation to fix anything. Okay, but if they agree to fix it, remember my repairs, if they agree to fix it, then they've changed the contract between the parties, because there's no obligation at law to do any repairs. But once the seller assumes that obligation by agreeing to a request for repairs, now they've created a new essentially an addendum to the contract that says, okay, all right, I agree to do these things if you agree to move forward. That's what that all does. But you know what, folks, I don't guarantee the places, and you go buy a brand new home. I don't care. You buy a brand new home. There's stuff wrong. The developer, they put little blue tags on things to let you know, oh, okay, we'll come back and we'll fix that. Yeah, but there's no obligation in our business, in resale, certainly. We don't guarantee the product. We are not the warrantor of that property. That's going to be something the buyer has to figure out if there's anything wrong with it that's not being disclosed to them by the seller. And by the way, the seller's got that standard of care that says that they knew or should have known. And if they don't make that disclosure, then that could be something that the buyer can go back after the seller for. Sorry, I forgot to take my water. All right. And then from there, but I think that's a big point. And so don't feel bad when that buyer calls you up and says, oh, the dishwasher stopped working. Okay. That's why we kind of like to have a home warranty plan on these things. I like home warranty plans. I don't think I've ever done a transaction, didn't have one except for land, and I do a lot of land. Okay. But the home warranty is a great little thing to have in place, and it essentially takes care of some things. It's an insurance policy, so I don't give insurance advice either, right? I don't give medical advice other than taking aspirin, that kind of thing. So bottom line is that's why we like to have that home warranty. Okay, so let's take a look at number 3. Does not guarantee the performance, adequacy, or completeness of things that other people do or that the seller does. So any products or repairs provided or made by the seller or others. And that's, folks, I'm going to tell you, this is a warning, okay? When you refer competent help, okay, you want to refer at least 3, okay? And so home inspectors, for example, you need to be referring, you need to give the buyer the choice, all right? And the buyer asks you, who should I use? Then your answer has to always be, I don't know, here's the phone book. If the buyer says, who do you use? I can say, well, I personally like this person in all of my home inspections, but I'm not going to be the warrantor of that product. So at the end of the day, buyer makes the decision who they're going to do. Otherwise, you could end up getting a cause of action for negligent referral. So we don't want that. We learn all these really crazy legal words when we get ourselves into a position where somebody's feeling, like they were taken advantage of. Okay. And so we want to kind of avoid that if we can. All right. So again, negligent referral, very dangerous. We bring it up in the risk management committee all the time. Some of the brightest real estate attorneys in the state of California all come in once a week or once a month on a Wednesday. And we have an absolutely amazing meeting. I don't know what I'm doing there, but I just feel honored actually even be there. But God, I learned a lot of stuff. So, okay, so it doesn't guarantee the performance of any repairs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't we talk about that a minute ago? All right, so why do I like credits? I like credits because it takes away all the, credits cure a lot of evil, as we say. Okay, number 4, does not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of the common areas or areas off the site of the property. And that includes, that's in your listing agreement, that's in your buyer representation agreement. We do not, broker, everybody agrees, broker does not have an obligation to go to the common area, make sure the pool's working, make sure the gates work, make sure it's got childproof fence, all that kind of stuff. Not in my job description. Okay. All right. So we do not have an obligation to do that. Okay. Or off site, I don't have an obligation to go check the storage facility that's a block away. Not going to do it. Okay. Shall not be responsible for identifying defects on the property. Okay. So my obligation by law is that from that education required to get my real estate license. If I start quoting things like stem walls and leaching fields and things like that, then I might be getting outside of my area of expertise. And by the way, that could be a problem, right? So listen, what did I have to do? What did I have to learn to become a broker? I had all these classes that I took. That's the limit that I'm required to do. It's when I say something stupid that goes beyond that, like, well, it looks like an electrical problem to me, or I had a great case where the agent said, water stain noted in ceiling, and it's one of my favorite, I quote it all the time, and it turned out it was paint, leaking from paint cans up in the attic, and you know what, that was an expensive ticket because it turned out it was the paint is a hazardous material. So, it just gets crazy, okay? So I'm not responsible for identifying defects. I have a duty of a reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection of the premises. My obligation is to disclose, not diagnose. Okay, write that down. Disclose, not diagnose. The minute I start getting into diagnosing things is the minute I'm going to start having all kinds of problems. Okay, all right. So I'm just not that person. I'm not the expert. Hire an expert to do all that kind of stuff. Okay, so identifying defects on the property in common areas or off-site, unless the defects are, what did we say, visually observable by inspection of reasonably accessible areas of the property or are already known to the broker. Okay, so things that I might already know, I have to tell them about. Okay, but I don't have an obligation. Remember, I don't have to dig, poke. Please don't lift the carpet. A slab looks fine to me. A couple of really good cases on that. Or what's that smell? And we start moving boxes out of the way. Oh, it looks like Stachybotrys to me. Well, gee, now all of a sudden you're a mold expert. Okay, so it needs to be outside of your vocabulary. Don't be touching stuff. Okay, again, follow the advice of your broker. Follow the advice of your attorney. Reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection. Was it a reasonably competent inspection? Okay. All right. So let's take a look. Shall not, number 6, shall not be responsible for inspecting public records or permits. Please, here you got it right here. It says I don't have to go pull permits. If I go pull permits, I've just gone outside of my area of expertise, and I might be liable for pulling the permits. I might be liable for missing permits, or I might be liable, for saying that there aren't any, or I might be liable, I got the wrong property and I said there are permits when in fact there aren't, or that the permits are sufficient for the purposes that the buyer has. The buyer needs to do that. Buyer can pay people, I don't know, was it $50? Pay somebody to go do it. I'm not that $50 guy. Okay, so shall not be responsible. These are all not statements for inspecting public records or permits considering title or use of the property. Number 7, a broker shall not be responsible for identifying the location of boundary lines. Had a really good case on that, where the agent said, there was a fence, and the buyer says, how far is the property line? And the agent says, it's over there where the fence is. Well, problem was there were 2 other lots before you got to the fence, and none of them were fenced. Well, gee, lo and behold, a fence comes up the day after this buyer gets title of the property, and the buyer's going, wait a minute, I thought I owned all the way out to that other fence. And it turns out, there were 2 lots that I missed. And the agent made the misrepresentation by saying it goes out to that fence, and it's like, people who put in fences are not surveyors, okay? Please don't do that, okay? So I'm not responsible for doing that. Identifying the location of boundary lines or other items affecting title, let title do that. Number 8, shall not be responsible for verifying square footage. And you know what? We shoot ourselves in the foot all the time on that. And Gov Hutchinson, God love him, CAR counsel, I think he's assistant general counsel for California Association of Realtors, super guy. Everybody loves Gov, right? Okay, what can you say? But even he says, you know, square footage, #1 litigated issue against real estate agents. So you know what? We don't put square footage anywhere. We put it in the MLS because it's required. But you know, even our agents understand in our office that if you change it, you're going to have to defend it because we're not going to defend it for you. So take what the tax record says and deal with it. All right. So not responsible for verifying square footage, representations of others, or information contained in reports. Listen, you hired the inspector to go out and do the inspection. You need to talk to them about what they put in their report. Okay. And remember, their report is different than your report. So make sure that you are referring to the source. Okay. Multiple listing service. This is all Civil Code 1088, 1086, 1088. That says that you and I are responsible for information that's in the MLS. Paragraph number 8 of this agreement says that the buyer and the seller won't litigate against each other, but that doesn't protect us. Okay, so multiple listing advertisements, flyers, other promotional materials. So, you know, we'd like not to be responsible for any of that stuff. So we need to, again, make sure we don't go outside of our field of expertise. Okay, so, and then this is a good one. Number 9, brokers shall not be responsible for determining the fair market value of the property. You know, we don't know. We're not appraisers, right? If you are, then, you know, you need to make sure you separate the 2 licenses. Okay. Just like me, you know, I have a law degree, big deal. I'm not a practicing attorney. I'm a real estate broker, and I happen to have a law degree. I keep those 2 very, very separate, very distinct. Okay. All right. So, not to fair market value of the property or any personal property. I hate it when we get involved in refrigerators, washers, and dryers. We start putting in stuff like that, and then guess what? You know, now all of a sudden we're handling personal property, and we think, well, it's part of the property. Well, is it personal or is it real? Well, we're going to get into the 7. I just had this conversation with one of our agents who's also an attorney. You know, well, what are 7 methods of attachment? You know, is it personal or is it real? And it's like, no, I don't want to go down that path. But, you know, here we are. We do transactions, or I want all the patio furniture, you know, and then the appraiser comes back and says, I think the patio furniture is worth about $100 grand. I'm going to subtract that from what you're paying for the property. And that means the buyer's got to come up with more money, and we get into all that. So please don't do personal property. Do whatever you want to do. Number 10, brokers shall not be responsible for providing legal or tax advice. So here's the language among 1,000 other places. Please don't give legal or tax advice. Here it is. This is your off the hook part that says that the broker is not responsible for giving tax or legal advice, okay, in the transaction. Regarding any aspect of the transaction. So, you know, we get in trouble when we do things like a 1031 tax deferred exchange. That's IRC code 1031, right? And it's like, be careful what you know. Be careful that you don't know too much. If you want your legal malpractice to kick in, if you're not an attorney, you don't have it, okay? Lawyers pay a heck of a lot more money for malpractice than we do as brokers. I can tell you that. All right. So don't give them legal advice. Please don't give them tax advice. Refer them to the appropriate professional. Okay. Number 11, brokers shall not be responsible for providing other advice or information that exceeds the knowledge, education, and experience required to perform real estate license activity. I don't care if you're brand new in the business or you've been in the business for 40 years, you are only held to the standard of what it took to get your license, okay? And believe me, when I got my license, the rules were very different than they are today, but that is all I'm held accountable for, unless I step outside of my authority. And I've had you know, people at the DRE, whom I love the DRE, but I've had people there who have said, you know, we think that if you're in San Diego doing transactions in Temecula, you might be outside of your area of expertise. And I'm thinking I might agree with that because, you know, what do you know about the disclosure requirements up there? You know, that kind of thing. You take a listing in Temecula, but you're not familiar with the market. You're not familiar, you know, you might be outside of your area of expertise. Now, you've heard me say it a million times that my license says California. It doesn't say San Diego, but at the same time, we've got to be careful. That might be better referral than it is trying to do, you know, keep the whole thing. Okay. So, so look at my duty, and that's what this whole paragraph is all about. I'm going to define my duty. I'm going to limit my liability. Okay. All right. buyer and seller. So this is that final admonition that I love to tell everybody. Buyer and seller agree to seek legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from who? From the appropriate professional. And I always say, I'm not that professional. And some people say, well, yes, you are. And I go, I am not. I do not give legal advice. I don't give tax advice, nothing. Okay, I just don't do that. I give real estate advice, and I'm going to stick to that. Okay, so this is again that last little dig that says, you know what? I'm not going to tell you those things. You need to go figure those things out. Now, from all the time that we've spent on this paragraph, are you understanding why it is important to go over the contract with the client? Or did you go over with the purchase offer? You've got a first-time home buyer. Did you actually sit down and explain to them what they're agreeing to? Okay, don't just say, oh, it's all boilerplate language, it applies to everything, it's created to protect you. No, you are held accountable for what's in the contract. So please don't minimize that when you're talking with your client. Make sure that you have explained to your client what those things are. And I don't mean you have to read it line by line. God knows if you spend all the time on it that we spent on this contract, you're going to be there for, well, obviously for weeks, right? So it's a pretty deep subject. You need to keep your ears open. You need to listen. You need to, operate your transaction with all your senses. Make sure that you are sensitive to any of the special needs that your buyer might have, and make sure that you address those things. So, you have a license to do real estate. You do not have a license to practice law. You do not have a license to give tax advice. You do not have a license to give insurance advice. All of the title, that's insurance, right? In California, it is. Okay, so you don't have a license to do all that stuff. Create a list for yourself. We have an approved vendor list in our office that we actually send out to our client, when they're getting ready to do a transaction. Here's a list of really good lawyers, really good attorneys. And we got a list, and we give them escrow companies, we give them title companies, we give them photographers, we give them all kinds of stuff, but we avoid the temptation of giving them only one. Even though we have one that we really, really like a lot, we need to give them a bunch, okay? And I don't mean to fill up their pages with stuff, but give them at least 3, avoid the negligent referral, but clearly please do not give that advice, okay? And that's kind of what that's all about, okay? Y'all take care for now. Bye-bye.
Need more help? Contact SDAR Member Services at 858-715-8040 or membership@sdar.com.